talk a little bit about how to use this thickness planer. We'll talk about what it can be used for, we'll talk a little bit about the different parts, and we'll talk about how to safely use the machine. The main thing the thickness planer is used for is to make boards thinner and smooth across the entire surface. So this board, as you can see, for example, is really kind of rough and bumpy and not very good looking on this side. This other side has been plain. It's a lot cleaner, it's a lot smoother. So the planer can be used to clean this up, get it smoother, get it cleaner, and make the entire board thinner, which a lot of times is necessary in woodworking projects. There are a few different parts you're going to need to know on the thickness planer. This piece is called the in-feed table. This piece is called the out-feed table, kind of like on the jointer. These rollers up here are really just there to set boards on in between planes and roll them back and forth. They're just there to help you out. They don't really need to be used for anything other than that. The on-off switch is in this black box right here, green one to turn it on, red one to shut it off. The last part you're going to need to know about is this wheel. Turning this wheel will raise and lower the in-feed and out-feed tables. Every time you pass your board through the machine, you need to turn on the wheel a little bit to raise the table up to put the board into the cutter head, to raise the board into the cutter head. The cutter head is underneath this guard right here. So if you didn't raise the table with that wheel, eventually the machine would just stop taking off any material because the board wouldn't get any closer to the cutter head. So every time you run the board through, you want to turn on that wheel. So the wheel is pretty important to know. You turn it clockwise like this to raise the table, and turn it counterclockwise like this to lower the table. You'll need to know how to lower the table as well, because if the last person to use the machine before you had a lot thinner board than you, you will have to adjust it with the wheel to lower the table to accommodate your thicker board. One thing to think about is where to stand when you are using the thickness planer. The best place to stand would probably be right here. Over there you can see there's a bit of a crowded area. We got the table saw here, and then there's some ventilation pipes right there. And that area can get a little tough to stand in, so it's best to stand over there. Another nice part about standing over there is you have good access to the wheel, so you can turn that easily and raise and lower the table as you need to. I would not recommend standing directly behind the planer right here. The cutter head spins in this direction. So if you're pushing a board through and you were to get a kickback, meaning the cutter head were to grab onto the board and send it out of the machine and you're standing behind it, you're probably going to get hit, and that's not a very good thing to happen. So always try to avoid standing directly behind the machine. I recommend standing on that side of the machine. Another thing to be aware of when using the thickness planer is that it pretty much does all the work for you. You just have to set the board on this table and start to feed it through, and the machine will grab onto it, cut it for you, and put it out on the other side, as you saw in the very beginning of this video. Knowing that information, you still need to pay attention to what you're doing and what's going on. Some students might think, well, I can just set it on there and carry on my conversation with my friend. This is obviously not a good idea. You still need to pay attention to what's going on. You should not be talking to your friend or paying attention to what something else is going on in the room. Always keep your attention on what you are doing, even though the machine is basically doing the work for you. The shortest board you can run through the planer is about 12 inches. If you notice, that's a bit of a theme in this class. The jointer, shortest board there, 12 inches. Planer, 12 inches. Table saw will be 12 inches as well. So if your board is any shorter than 12 inches, you can't run it through the planer. Reason why this is so important to follow on the planer is because there's the cutter head, as I talked about under here, but there's also two hold down rollers. Those hold down rollers hold the board down, as the name would suggest, as the board is going through the planer. If your board is shorter than 12 inches, your board might actually get stuck in between those two hold down rollers, which can be very damaging to your board and also more damaging to the machine itself. So if you're going to run a board through the machine, it has to be at least 12 inches long. If you made a mistake and your board is shorter than 12 inches, come and talk to me. There's a way we can fix that, but just make sure you talk to me first. Don't run it through the planer if it's shorter than 12 inches. Another thing you're going to want to think about is how do you want to orient your board as you run it through the planer. What face do you want facing up? So on this board you can see there's this face that isn't quite as pretty. It's got some dark, dirty marks on it. This piece down here actually has a little bit of bark on it. The other side is cleaned up. This side is looking pretty nice. So what side do I want facing up? Do I want the nice clean side facing up, or do I want this dirtier side facing up? Before, as you might recall, I talked about how the cutter head is up here. That is what does the cutting. Knowing that information, what face do you think you want facing up? Do you want the dirtier face or the cleaner one facing up? You always want to put the uglier or dirtier face facing up. This way, as it goes through the machine, the cutter head, which is above it, cuts the material and cleans it up. This side used to look just like this side before I planed it down a couple of times. So right now you can see again, pretty dirty. This side is pretty nice and pretty cleaned up. Still needs a little bit of work, but it's a lot nicer than this one. And that's because I only ran this side facing up. Now this might change, so you want to pay attention to that. Right now, this is definitely the better face of the board. So this is the side I want to make sure is down, so that way the worst face, the uglier face, gets cut. But that might change, as I said. Eventually, as I run through a couple times, this side might become the better face, and this side might be the worst face. Then I'm going to want to flip my board. So it's always a good idea to pay attention to that. Always a good idea to make sure the better face is down and the uglier face is up. Because if you run the same face through every single time, then eventually your board is going to be too thin to where you can't plane it anymore, and you still might be left with this face right here, and you want to make sure you get it cleaned up and not like this for a couple of reasons. First off, it doesn't look as nice, and secondly, your board is going to get smoothed out a lot when you run through the planer as well. So if it's smoother, that means less sanding for you. So if your board never gets run through the planer with this face facing up, then you're going to have to do a lot more sanding. It's a lot more work for you. So just make sure when you're using the planer, you pay attention to what side is going up, what side is going down, and you always put the better side down, so that way the less good side is always facing up and getting smoothed out and cleaned up. It's also crucial to pay attention to the grain on the board. The grain refers to the way the lines are on the board. So in this board, you can see how the lines are running up and down like this. That is the grain of the board. You always want to pay attention to the grain on the board when you're using the planer or the jointer, as we talked a little bit about before as well. When you're going to use a planer, you always want to go with the grain like this, never against the grain like this. Going against the grain is always a bad idea. For starters, most boards are not going to be 12 inches wide, so you don't even have the width that is required to run the board through the machine. But even if your board is 12 inches wide and narrow enough to fit through the machine, it's still not a good idea to go against the grain. The grain is very, very important to follow as you are doing pretty much any woodworking. If you go against the grain, what's going to happen is as the board is leaving the machine and getting run through the machine, instead of making a nice smooth cut, because it's going against the grain, the cutter will actually dig into the board and chew it up, as opposed to just make a nice smooth cut, especially on the edges. Just as the board passes through, I can almost guarantee you're going to have big chunks of material missing and ripped out of the corner of your board, and you obviously want to avoid that. So always make sure you go with the grain, never against the grain when you are using the planer. Now let's talk a little bit more about the wheel that I referred to before that raises and lowers the in-feed and out-feed table. When you are doing that, the amount you turn on that wheel makes a difference. The more you turn on it, the more material you're going to cut off at a time. The less you turn off, the less it's going to cut off at a time. So you got to ask yourself, how much do I want to turn that wheel at a time? The answer is about a quarter of a turn. So if it's at the very top like this right now, you want to go a quarter of a turn. So a quarter of a turn would be right about there. If it's there, you want to go another quarter of a turn right there. Another quarter of a turn would be right there, and so on and so forth. You don't want to do more than a quarter of a turn at a time. If you do more than a quarter of a turn at a time, it's going to be tough on the machine itself, and you have a lot better chance of dinging up your board and it not cutting very smooth as well. So a quarter of a turn is the most you should be cutting at a time. You can do less than a quarter of a turn if you want to. If your board is getting really close to the thickness that you need, and if you want to go less than a quarter of a turn, that's okay. If you want to go an eighth of a turn or even less than that, that's just fine. Just don't go more than a quarter of a turn at a time, because that is just asking for trouble, and your board is probably going to get ruined, or the machine might get ruined if you do more than a quarter of a turn at a time. So only do a quarter of a turn at a time. Another good question to ask is, how many boards can you run through the planer at once? As you can see, it has a pretty wide table, so you might want to think about how many can you put in there. You can't put in as many as it will take. For example, if I had a bunch of short boards like this, for example, I could put all kinds of them along here, but that's not a good idea. The best answer for this is 2. You can do 2 at a time, which works really good for you because in this class, when you're making the shelf, you will start off with 2 boards, so it actually works good. You can do both your boards at once, but you don't want to do 3 or 4. It gets to be too much work for the machine and it can't quite handle it. So 2 boards is the most you can do at a time. Before you turn on the planer and start running your material through, you need to check the height of the table. You need to make sure there's enough clearance so the board doesn't just run into the cutter heads and get stuck right away or anything like that. So you always need to check the height of the table before you actually turn the machine on. What you're looking for here is, can your board clear the cutter heads? Right now, as you can see, I can push the board through pretty easily and pull it back out so I know it clears the cutter head. That's what you're looking for. There are some anti-kickback teeth under there as well that you will hear. So there you can hear the anti-kickback teeth working on the board, and it even got a little stuck. So those teeth are there because they're designed to prevent the board from getting kicked back. Before, you might remember I talked about how you don't want to stand directly behind the machine when it's running. There is a set of anti-kickback teeth all along here that are supposed to prevent the board from getting kicked back. But this machine does have a lot of power, and I wouldn't necessarily always trust those teeth, and they have to grab in order to work. If they don't grab, then it's not going to work. So I wouldn't trust those anti-kickback teeth. But you do want to make sure the board clears the cutter head before you actually turn the machine on, and clears those anti-kickback teeth as well. Because of that height issue, I will ask that you talk to me before you actually use the planer. All the other machines in here, with the exception of the table saw, you can use by yourself whenever you want. But with this machine, you do need to talk to me first before you use it. I don't have to sit here and watch you the entire time when you're using it, but I do need to check to make sure you have it set up correctly, so that way when you do start the planer, it doesn't ruin anything on the planer or ruin anything on your board. This is a huge mistake I've seen students make over and over and over again throughout the years I've been doing this, and I want to prevent that in the future because the teeth on the cutter head are not very cheap to buy, and it's just hard on the machine in general. So before you turn on the machine and before you start using it, you need to ask me before you can use it. Otherwise, I'm going to be over here to shut it off immediately because you can't use it until you talk to me about it. I need to make sure it's set up correctly. If this table is too high, the board could get jammed up and cause some serious issues. So always talk to me before you start using it. And on the other end of that, if the table is way too low and you're sitting here running your board through, going a quarter of a turn, run it through, going a quarter of a turn, that could waste a lot of time. I mean, just lowering the table 3 or 4 turns, it would take you 16 passes to run your board through before you actually start cutting it. This could waste a lot of your time, and I want you to give you the most time possible to work, and it could waste the other students' times that are waiting to use the machine as well. So talk to me so I can help you make sure it's set up right before you start using the machine. I've talked a little bit about how you don't want to stand directly behind the machine when you're using it, and this is absolutely true. And there's one other major safety concern that you need to be aware of when you are using the planer, and that's pinching your fingers. What I have heard of happening at other times is getting your fingers pinched between the board that you're going to be planing and the table of the planer. Like I said before, there are 2 hold down rollers up here. Their job is to hold the board down flat and with a whole lot of pressure, so that way the board stays flat as it's being cut and run through the planer. They hold down with several hundred pounds of force, and they're also powered, so they turn. They are what grab onto the board and push it through as it's being cut. So if you go ahead and start to push a board through it, those hold down rollers will grab onto the board and pull it through, which can be very handy. But they also hold the board down. And if you have your fingers right here, for example, notice where my fingers are, notice how they're between the board and the table here. If I'm going to run my board through like this, and those hold down rollers grab onto the board, what's going to happen is they're going to slam the board down and pinch my fingers in between that board and that table. And like I said, the rollers usually hold down with a couple hundred pounds of force. So think about a person stomping on your fingers if you have your fingers on the ground. That's not going to feel too good. That would be similar to what's going on here. But the other issue there is then the rollers, once they grab onto the board, they're going to start pulling the board into the machine as well. And if your fingers are pinched in between there, they can start pulling your hand into the planer as well. So obviously that's a huge safety issue. I've never personally seen this happen to anybody. Everybody is careful enough to make sure they don't do this, and it's really, really easy to avoid this as well, but you still should be aware of it. The best thing to do to avoid this is Notice you have a nice infeed table here, and the boards you're going to be planing are not going to be all that long. So what you should do is set your board down first, make sure it's completely on the table and you don't touch it at all, and then push it through. Don't try to push it through and hang on to it at the same time. Not a good idea. Set it down and then push it through. That way there's no chance of your fingers getting stuck in between the board and the table. When you are running your board through, it's sometimes, especially on the first couple passes, the boards have a tendency to get stuck in the planer. Whether the rollers don't have a good enough grip on them, whether the surface on the board isn't quite flat, or whatever the case is, maybe the table's not adjusted quite correctly, the board sometimes gets stuck. If this happens, there's a few things you can do. First off, if you feel like it's necessary, you can shut the machine off, wait for it to stop, and then come and see me and I'll certainly help you out. Another thing you can try to do is push on the board a little bit. Sometimes it just takes a little nudge and the teeth will grab onto it or the rollers will grab onto it and it'll pull it through. If that doesn't work, what I find to work really good is usually jiggling the board back and forth a little bit. Sometimes this does take a bit of muscle because at this point the roller is usually, or at least the front roller, has a hold of the board and it's pressing down on it. And there's a lot of force on it, so it might take a little bit of effort to wiggle it back and forth, but if you can do that, the rollers will most likely grab onto it and start the board, and then it'll go through for you. Like I said, this usually only happens in the first couple passes. After you get the board started, it usually works pretty good from there, but if that does happen, like I said, try to push the board a little bit more, try to wiggle the board a little bit, or you can shut it off and talk to me. One thing that might happen is your board might get stuck right here or even in the planer a little bit. Your first instinct might be, well, I gotta push it a little bit harder, but never put your hands anywhere close to the cutter head. That's not a good idea. This is why I have this push stick right here. It's a little bit different than the push stick for the jointer or the other machines in here, but what you can do with this push stick is push the board through so that way your hands are safely back here as opposed to getting your hands way close to that cutter head. You can also even set the push stick down and push on it like this, so that way your fingers, again, have no risk of getting pinched between the push stick and the surface of the table also. But don't reach down there and try to push it through with your hands. That's not a good idea. Another huge mistake I see students make is they want to see what's going on down there. And I understand that. It's kind of interesting. But what a lot of students will do is they'll put their face down here when it's running and try to see what's going on. This is a horrible, horrible idea. As I said, this machine can send boards flying back. I've never seen this machine do it, but it's always a risk. Kickback could happen, and if your face is right here, looking into the machine, trying to see what's going on, and a board comes kicking back at you, it's not going to be a good thing. Also, sometimes there's little chunks of wood that get stuck in the machine. And if your face again is down here and you're seeing what's going on and those little chunks all of a sudden come free and come flying at you, again, not a good idea. I don't know why students think it's a good idea to put their face down here to check out what's going on. I understand they're curious. And if you're curious about it, certainly let me know. I will be happy to lower the table and actually show you what's going on down there, or even take the cover off, which I do sometimes, and explain to you exactly what's going on so you can see it. But putting your face down here when it's running is a very, very terrible idea. Never do that. So that is a thickness planer. It's a very, very handy machine. It saves you a lot of time as far as making your boards smoother, and it'll make them thinner and cleaner and more uniform and make your boards easier to work with in general. It's a great machine. Just make sure you follow the rules and safety precautions that I talked about in this video, and you should be safe when you use the planer. If you got any questions about using the planer, talk to me. Again, you should talk to me before using the planer anyway, just to make sure it's set up correctly. But otherwise, if you have any other questions, or if you want to see what everything under here looks like, let me know and I'll be happy to help with that.